celebration of Dean Chris Culp's 25 years of service and leadership at the Disciples Divinity House. So on behalf of the Board of Trustees and of the entire DDH community, thank you for coming and welcome. I'm Andrew Packman. I am a PhD candidate in theology and your moderator tonight, and also an 8th-year Disciples Divinity House scholar. Not the longest in this room, I dare say. But that time has afforded me the opportunity that many of you also have had to be able to attest very personally to the value of the Dean's leadership and theological vision casting here at the house and at the Divinity School. Dean Culp is, among other things, an argument and vocation clarifier, an institution guider, an occasional raiser of eyebrows, ambiguously, that can mean a good or bad thing. I've been on both sides of that. And generally and most simply, an excellent dean to this house. So I hope, just at the beginning, we can take a moment to thank Dean Culp publicly. Like all things of lasting value, it's hard to calculate the impact that Dean Culp has had on this place. Its mark is left on the texture of human souls, in stimulated imaginations, invigorated loyalties, and sharpened sensibilities. So how do you mark it? How do you acknowledge that as a community? The Board of Trustees has seen fit to do it this way, to celebrate the Dean's 25th anniversary by attending precisely to those registers of value. We have convened a panel of 3 DDH alumni whose vocational lives have led them to labor in local congregations, general church bodies, and academic settings. They've been asked to reflect on their vocational pursuits in light of the themes articulated in Dean Culp's book, Vulnerability and Glory, a Theological Account. This book proposes an account of creaturely life before God. And so tonight we will honor the Dean's work in the most Chicago of ways by submitting it to rigorous exploration and by testing its claims. I invite you to consider these reflections as test cases to see if this is indeed an accurate representation of creaturely life before God. How does this book illumine the vocational lives of these 3 vulnerable and glorious alumni? And how do the book and these lives together testify to the value of this house and the dean who has led it for the last quarter of a century? So a word first about this book for those who have not yet read it. The central thesis of Vulnerability and Glory is deceptively simple. Life before God is marked by vulnerability to change. The implications of this are where it gets complex. This changeableness makes us susceptible both to devastation, all that this world can hurl at us, but also to transformation. This means that creaturely existence is neither simply a vale of tears, nor a triumphant march towards the kingdom of God on earth. It is, in the Dean's words, a dynamic field of tensions and conversions, one that is tufted with a dizzying variety of objects and forces that vie for our attention, our loyalty, and our love. We are constantly pulling and being pulled in multiple directions, some of which are gracious, some demonic. While this fact might tempt us to barricade ourselves down and to protect ourselves from these very real threats that haunt our world, the Dean suggests that these attempts at invulnerability are not only impractical, because life just is vulnerable and there's no way we're going to get around that, but further, these attempts at invulnerability barricade us from the life-augmenting possibilities of transformation as well. As the Apostle Paul put it, our bodies are fragile earthen vessels, but they can also bear the glory of God. So instead of invulnerability, the well-lived life before God is marked by resistance to that which threatens the integrity of creaturely life, and grateful delight in a world that God calls good. Unsurprisingly for the dean of the disciples' Divinity House, these tensive contours of life converge at tables, both liturgical ones and the common ones that populate dinner rooms and kitchens and restaurants in Hyde Park that we'll be at later. These all mark sites where our sensibilities are stretched and trained to yearn for heavenly bread, even as we savor the earthy, gustatory delights of our daily bread, broken, shared, and enjoyed. So next I will introduce our three alumni in the order that they will present. First, Larry Bouchard is professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. He earned his MA and PhD while at the House, and his tenure overlapped with the dean's own PhD work by 1 year. Professor Bouchard previously served as the chair of the DDH board and continues to serve there. His research explores intersections between imaginative literature, especially prose, fiction, and drama, and what the Divinity School calls constructive studies, theology, philosophy of religion, and ethics. His most recent monograph, Theater and Integrity, juxtaposes original readings of dramatic works ranging from Antigone to Angels in America, with theological and ethical reflection on the relation of selves to personal, moral, and bodily integrity. Larry's work couples an enduring interest in tragedy as a lens for interpreting suffering and evil, with a constructive theological interest in kenosis and its significance for ethics. The Reverend April Luton is Vice President of Development and Marketing at the National Benevolent Association, which is the health and social services general ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. She is an MDiv alumna of DDH, and she serves as a trustee of the House and as chair of its development committee. Prior to joining the NBA, the National Benevolent Association. She's also a point guard, but April has led development efforts at Chicago Theological Seminary and worked as a community organizer for the Asian American Institute in Chicago. Her service with the General Church includes a stint as moderator and member of the board of directors for NAPAD, the North American Pacific Asian Disciples, and board of directors for the Christian Church and for the much beloved Disciples World magazine. Finally, the Reverend Terry Howard Owens is the Dean of Students at the Divinity School and pastor of First Christian Church in Downers Grove. She is also an MDiv alumna of DDH, and earlier this year in February, Reverend Owens was nominated by the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to serve as our next general minister and president. The election will be held in July. After completing a degree in government and Afro-American studies at Harvard, Dean Owens spent 23 years in the private sector before arriving at the Divinity School and DDH and going on to be ordained at Light of the World Christian Church in Indianapolis. She also serves on the boards of the Chicago Theological Seminary and the Higher Education and Leadership Ministries of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ.
I wanted to study tragedy and theater, and I did. And I've been studying tragedy and theater all the time ever since. When I read and reread your book, I felt that you had been responding to questions that I've been asking all my life. And I was quite moved by this. So what I want to do today is go over some of the themes of your book as a way of saying thank you. So bear with me. The University of Chicago College graduates and University of Virginia philosopher Richard Rorty considered it to be impossible to hold together one's commitment to justice and one's passion for beauty, hold them together in a single thought or idea, by which he meant a philosophical idea. As he grew up reading philosophy, he could not, try as he might, reconcile his idiosyncratic devotion to, say, wild orchids, a devotion requiring much time and energy and cash to nourish, with the pursuit of social justice for those whom history and nature leave bereft. It could be a commitment to justice represented by, say, Trotsky, or by Rorty's maternal grandfather, the social gospel theologian Walter Rauschenbusch. Humanity appears to require both justice and beauty, but they seem to Rorty finally incommensurable. He came to think that there could be no valid and true bridge running between beauty and justice in either direction. Unless, he wrote once, you were some kind of religious believer, as he emphatically was not. In his autobiographical essay, Trotsky and the Wild Orchids, Rorty does not see exactly how religious beliefs unite love of beauty with love of justice. But it's interesting, though, that in that essay, Rorty does not mount an argument against them. He just says that while growing up into adulthood, he knew he would never have the humility to be religious. As if the single idea or belief he had sought required humility in practice in order to be thought at all. What does that mean? An idea that you had to be humble in practice to think it. And he knew he couldn't do it. It would be tedious for me to praise Chris Cope's practical theological humility, although I definitely could do that at great length. I know how to be tedious. I know how to praise tediously. If you don't believe me, listen. I can report that as I have read and reread Vulnerability and Glory, I have sensed that Chris is indeed thinking through, theoretically and practically, the unity and disunity between justice and beauty, or to say it a different way, Chris is thinking about coextensive relationships that do happen between tragic suffering and extraordinary joys. If there is a single thought that can hold together social justice with individual particular joys, it may well be her thought of vulnerability. As you've heard, Chris observes on one hand, vulnerability has Latin roots relating it to the word wound, or the susceptibility to being wounded. And so vulnerability is inextricably related to suffering. You can't suffer unless you're vulnerable. On the other hand, she shows that woundability is also changeability. The possibility of changing or being transformed, and thus vulnerability is coextensive with life and change, that is, with living. There are not two different sorts of vulnerability, but limitless varieties of vulnerability. Vulnerability in more ways than you can imagine. To be a finite creature, or to be a process in nature, is to be vulnerable, and vice versa. Vulnerability is creaturely. So then is vulnerability a so-called neutral category for Chris? I don't think so. Chris's reflections on Augustine suggest that vulnerability is entailed in the goodness of creation. Nothing creaturely can be as such inherently neutral. If created by God, its inherent character is good. So before it gets entangled with suffering or with structures of malice and harm, vulnerability as changeability is good. Augustine thought evil was a pure negative. Evil is the privation, the corruption, the rusting away, as it were, of the good. Evil had, for Augustine, no positive existence, no efficient cause, but only a deficient cause, whatever he meant by that. So among other things, evil would corrupt, diminish, and even threaten to destroy creaturely vulnerability. Get that? Evil would threaten to destroy creaturely vulnerability, threaten to destroy the creaturely capacity to change, as well as be harmed. Oddly then, to actually be invulnerable would be to be dead. If self-destructive attempts to be in self-destructive attempts to be invulnerable, the evil one, or some harming social structure, is one that threatens others' vulnerability. Indeed, threatens creation's vulnerable potentialities for change and life. The tyrant desires, in a way, dead stasis, not transformation. Insofar as vulnerability is created, creaturely and open toward transforming life into more life, vulnerability is good. However, Chris might worry about a danger in my account of vulnerability. The danger is that of theodicy, about which at several points in the book she expresses severe caution. In theology, theodicies are arguments that purport to justify God's power and goodness with the presence of evil and suffering. Theodicy might be any attempt to resolve problems of suffering and evil with a concept, such as the dichotomy of the invisible and visible church, which Chris criticizes. Theodicies attempt to justify God by applying some very good notion, some fine abstraction by which to save the face of God, or to make the finite faces of God's glory invulnerable. Which finally brings me to the other word, glory. I admit that having found ideas of glory off-putting, just as I have put off reading much of Hans Urs von Balthasar's 7-volume theological aesthetics, The Glory of the Lord. If glory etymologically in different languages is what elicits praise, then glory and praise, even praise for the glory of God, can seem discontinuous with a world fraught with tragic perils and radical evils. If glory connotes shining and luminosity, as it often does for Chris, then we may become aphasic, unable to speak at times when the light of the good is not evident, where flourishing is not seen, and devastation seems all. How is it that Chris so boldly juxtaposes vulnerability and glory? Let me make 3 observations about that. First, I think Chris would have us see that glory is the hard word to say here. Glories in life are simply there in the world, even when disconcertingly so. Ash in the air can make for beautiful sunsets, regardless of whose ash it is. in the pained voices of the schizophrenic patients. Psychiatrist R.D. Lang sometimes heard meanings like poetry. In the screaming hell of trench warfare, Army Chaplain Paul Tillich was comforted by Botticelli's serene painting, Madonna and Child with Singing Angels. In the beauty of the painting, there was beauty itself, he wrote. In Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, the devastated, unchurched preacher, Baby Suggs, gazes upon the glory of a color, lavender. In Trisago's Endo's silence, the hum of cicadas incessantly interrupts the silence of God. It is not always a comfort. And it's often quite disturbing that beauty and glory remain oddly there, attracting attention in fields of devastation. Glory there, and of course glory in places of preacherly flourishing, interrupts us. Glory pulls us up short. Brutal honesty demands that beauty and glory be noticed and acknowledged, even when and where praise feels odd or inappropriate. Second observation. Chris notices relationships of vulnerability and glory that do not justify suffering, nor deny the inherently excessive character of suffering, but rather are relationships where glory meets suffering and becomes vulnerable anew in the presence of suffering. Glory also meets and becomes vulnerable before faces and structures of malice, injustice, neglect, and collusion. Now recall that vulnerability is the very character of preacherliness. It is the finite preacher's susceptibility to harm and also to change. In chapter 5, called A Field of Tensions and Conversions, it appears to me that the inherently excessive character of vulnerability, we're always becoming more vulnerable, not less. The excessive character of vulnerability implies that vulnerability will tend toward increase. And in this increasing vulnerability, there may arise from time to time more possibilities for change and transformation, even for the renewal of life. As occasions of vulnerability increase, they may open up space for new responses, time for new encounters, and thus more occasions for meeting. Affects those it meets. As vulnerability, which remember is the plasticity of life, they can be both harmed and transformed. As vulnerability increases, iterates, folds and unfolds, it becomes hard to distinguish increasing vulnerability from glory. It appears that together, vulnerability and glory transform the meaning of entropy. Life not only runs down, but also makes room for more life, which playwright Tony Kushner and critic Harold Bloom say is the meaning of L'chaim. L'chaim really means more life, they say. My last observation, as I do Chris, is that the finite field of tensions and conversions is not a structure that guarantees more life. The glory of God that works within and is also other than such structures of life calls us, turns our voices, our hearing Our embodied spirits towards suffering, inviting new responses, new occasions teach new duties, seeing James Russell Lowell's old liberal hymn, time makes ancient good uncouth. The church in the world of society and nature, of cultures, environments, is given as means, and by no means the only means, through which to meet God's transforming grace and glory. Before faces of suffering and structures of harm, the truth is our being called by God to move, to serve and think and enjoy and struggle beside other persons and creatures who are bereft, vulnerable to living not, vulnerable to flourishing not, to not being at all. We, of course, are also such persons. Theodor Adorno once quoted a German proverb, "Woe speaks, go." That is, I think, woe does not speak run away, but says go toward woe, toward suffering, in order to resist its causes and attend its voices under pain. I think this humble and extremely bold book. In this book, Chris has been even more radical than Rorty or Adorno. Looking for God is also to hear glory and beauty speak go. Go, resist, and reform. But those who are not, go, enhance new life. The only way to justify the ways of God to suffering is to hear and pass on God's inviting, enticing, unrelenting command. Go do justice, go love mercy, even so much as to risk becoming lost in the glory of God's sharp, delightful command of love. Serve and enjoy. Before God and before devastation, be the earthen vessels we are called to be, broken yet full, vessels of new life. Like I am, Chris, like I am.
Good evening.
Good evening.
What an esteemed and handsome crowd you all are. Dean Culp, it is a privilege and honor to be part of this panel of speakers and storytellers and reflectors this evening in celebration of you. I bring greetings and sincere congratulations on behalf of many. From Mark Anderson, our president at the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and my colleagues at the NBA. I serve on staff, as was mentioned, as the Vice President of Development and Marketing. Two of my colleagues are also Divinity School alums and former DDH House scholars, Ayana Johnson-Watkins and Bonnie Osei Frimpong. My staff also includes many friends and fans of Dean Culp, Danny, Rebecca, Ben, Dean, and Verzola. They share their absolute joy and celebration with you. Other Disciples friends that I've recently been in conversation with, such as Cindy Kim Hangst, Sisa Payuyo Younglan Kim, Jessica Kim, and Shonda Jha, also share their admiration, respect, and congrats. As members of the North American Pacific Asian Disciples, we are a community that has known you, Dean Culp, for many years. In the words of Cindy, she says, she doesn't remember church without thinking of you. Your support and active participation within NAPAD has meant so much. From co-chairing working groups to serving on pastoral relations committees, you have accompanied, nurtured, and shared in our sorrows and celebrations. May you feel the love, respect, and sincere joy from NAPAD on this special anniversary. Church for me has always been about community. Yes, both of my parents serve as local church pastors, not only in Disciples congregations, yet also with the United Methodists and the Presbyterians. Needless to say, I grew up with many grandparents in church and youth group members that became extended family. As a child of NAPAD, I recall heated debates around ways of recognizing and empowering women to be nurtured into leadership both in church and in academia. In our often patriarchal Asian cultures, these were complex discussions, let alone the added cultural layers of how Filipinos, Samoans, and Pacific Islanders, Chinese, and Koreans approach and consider the issues. Back when our denomination had paid staff positions for young adult and campus ministries, I was part of a community conversations of how to develop healthy and relevant models for leadership development. I recall conversations with Reverend Dennis Landon, another DDH alum, and then president for Higher Education Ministries for the church. We spoke about imagining the possibilities of bringing diverse groups of young people together without a full and goal-oriented agenda. In essence, bringing together people so that connections could be made and more organic solutions could be discussed related to barriers for leadership in the church and constructive ways to encourage, enhance, and engage young disciples. These were the beginnings of what became the Disciples Leadership Institute. I name these scenarios of intentional community for a couple of reasons. One, this is how I have experienced the positive power of church calling people together to do and address the realities in our lives. Second, community is named and provides a foundational context to Dean Culp's reflections in Vulnerability and Glory. The church is a gathered people who are interrelated in a common life in Christ. It is neither a superpersonal sacramental agent nor an institutional guarantor of saving doctrine. She goes on to write, church can bestow recognition, a sense of belonging, an assurance of the ultimate rightness and goodness of things, integration with and differentiation from society, socialization, and sanctions for behavior. Intentional church community is theologically and ethically complex and responsive. I was asked to reflect on how vulnerability and glory helps to inform, describe, and challenge our institutional church and our denomination. As I mentioned earlier, I serve on staff with one of our denomination's general ministries. What that means is that we are one of several nonprofit organizations which operate within and under the umbrella of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. The MBA is also one of the oldest general ministries. In fact, this year, 2017, marks our own milestone of 130 years of health and social service ministries with the Disciples Church. As many of you know, for an organization this age, we have experienced the extreme highs of institutional success and abundance, as well as the sorrowful valleys of bankruptcy, unpopular executive leadership, and the struggles of missional identity and core purpose. In 2012, the NBA's newly called president, Mark Anderson, contacted and invited me to apply for the position with that primary purpose of helping to rebuild community and renew the focus and identity of a general ministry for our Christian church, Disciples of Christ. 5 years later, we are living in robust ways into our vision of creating communities of compassion and care, especially through supporting and nurturing a diversity of health and social service outreach that was and is already happening across the life of the church. In so many situations, Disciples leaders, clergy and laity, and local congregations were simply grateful to know that they had conversation partners and additional networks of support and resources for the work and ministry that they are already doing. As a point of personal privilege, I also think it helps when an organization has 3 disciples, count them 3, Divinity House alums on staff in its time of reorganization and strategic visioning. For the NBA, one of the first major initiatives that we all took very seriously was the process of listening deeply to individuals, small groups, and with churches all across the country. We took time and care to hear the questions, hopes, and frustrations of many. Dean Culp writes about this kind of process in the section Situated in the Midst of Life. begin in the villages, in the midst of daily living. Underscore the entwined personal, social, and ecological vulnerabilities of daily existence. Promise and peril appear in mundane places and needs, for we find good news and healing, as well as fear, resentment, greed, and destruction. With NBA and previous administrations, the sentiment was often that as a ministry, we were not connected to disciples, nor were we hearing what the wider church needed or was calling us to be. When I consider institutions of the church, those formal and legal entities that govern, guide, provide services, and direct advocacy efforts, the question of how institutional communities live into and through vulnerabilities is often not a question that bubbles up as a means of being constructive or informative. More likely, institutions respond to vulnerabilities in reactive ways, and sometimes institutions choose even not to respond. Some of the following sentiments you may have heard or even yourselves spoken. You've sold your building or offices and you're moving to a virtual model or community-based model of ministry. When did this happen? And what does that mean? We're selling off a third of our church property so that we can remain open? Who was involved in that decision? How does that impact our future? Hold on. Our endowment that used to be in double digits has now been spent and we're overdrawing for our investment earnings to pay the bills, and we've been doing this for 5 years? These are questions and commentaries taken from very real situations, many of which some of you can relate to personally. Yet, during my 3 years of Disciples History and Polity class with our esteemed Dr. Clark Gilpin, I vividly recall learning about manifestations of the church, the ways in which we are local congregations and worshiping bodies, as well as regional collectives and area clusters. And then, of course, our general or national entities designed to connect and to resource. When we have such comprehensive institutional structures meant to provide numerous contacts and points of affinity, interest, and expertise, why then is the most frequently asked questions across our church involve, why do I feel so isolated and without conversation partners? Is there anyone else asking the questions I ask or struggling through similar issues? As disciples, we have some challenging institutional divides. Our manifestations of church have morphed into divisions. Some as solid like a picket fence between two homes, which at least you can see over that fence. And others like that metal and steel wall that a certain president wants to expand and build more of along our nation's southern borders. The organizations and institutions of our church seek to portray a kind of strength and resiliency that centers often around survival and maintenance. I have to wonder, though, if that sentiment would alter and change if there was greater trust, connections, and relationships that would allow for exploration and imagination of new futures. We are reminded that vulnerability is a basic aspect of creaturely existence and a situation wherein the grace and glory of God may be known. It is not a condition to be overcome. Vulnerability and transformation are built in from the very beginning, as it were. New creatures and vessels are formed from other valuable and changeable things. Our beloved Disciples Divinity House knows all about valuable and changeable things when in the fall of 1975, women were allowed to be presidents and scholars of the house. In recent years, married couples, straight, gay, and lesbian, have been welcomed into our community of scholars. Students with disabilities, often isolated and dealing with issues on their own, are not only welcome, but with intentional planning and preparation. As a member of the DDH board, I know we are deep in conversations and plans around accessibility that is expansive and comprehensive. Before I step away, though, and leave you all with the impression that the institutions of the church are only hopeless and non-imaginative, allow me to speak aloud some very real places of innovation. You are encouraging, empowering, and stretching communities to be church in different ways, beyond the often historic steeple structures and identities, to be witness and safe places for people to come for respite, encouragement, and meaningful solidarity. In educational classrooms, folks like Larry, Santiago, Pam, Gary, Crystal, Clark, Cynthia, Yvonne, Chris, and many more of you also in these chairs who stand in front of classrooms. You are challenging students with original texts and reminding them that the power to think critically and analytically will help them in all aspects of their personal and professional lives. In regional life, we now have 17 regional ministers that are women across 32 of our disciples' regions. Just this past Sunday, Dean Culp, Tendiwe, and myself were present for the installation of Reverend Joanne Bell Haynes, the newly called Executive Regional Minister for the Central Rocky Mountain region. Joanne and other regional leaders are seeking to actively reimagine regional ministry and life for our church. For general church ministry, you already know that for the NBA, not only have we welcomed a transformation of ministry and a recommitment to mission, we connect and we collaborate with other general ministries, such as Week of Compassion, led by DDH alum Vin Wen, and Higher Education Ministries with Chris Dorsey, and partners like Hope, Partnership and Church Extension with Bethany Lowry, and Pension Fund with Aaron Smith and staff leadership. Of course, another one who, as you have heard, has been interviewed, called, and nominated to guide, pastor, and lead us in a small role, known as General Minister and President, is our own Terry Gordo. With these names and even more that I did not have time to mention, and the various communities and organizations, there is real commitment to the vitality and relevance of our church. Dean Culp reminds us that God is always forming and reforming the mundane, vulnerable stuff of creaturely existence. We can affirm a living God who moves through a creation that can be called good, who strengthens and redeems vulnerable creatures, including even vulnerable institutions and formal entities, and whose glory crowns rather than defeats the earth and its creatures. A dear colleague reminds me, sometimes daily, and others frequently, that as people of faith, we have what we need to make a difference and positive impact. We only simply need to look around and beyond ourselves, maybe to new models, or with people we have never spoken to or invited into conversation. The skills, insights, and wisdom is in our midst, and we need only to be open for true conversion and transformation. For 25 years, Dean Culp, you have been leading and guiding students, scholars, and community members with this reminder and message of hope and possibilities. Your writings and publications, I have a couple on my bookshelves, are a kind of constant workbook that I, and I know others, reference and utilize when we need inspiration or different ways of considering what is it that we are dealing with at the moment. Also, your ever-present counsel and friendship is welcome, and as you know, and as many of you know, continues even after we leave the residence of this place. You have impacted the lives of so many, and I include myself in that grateful crowd. May you feel and know our deep gratitude and joy with and for you. We honor you today and are so grateful for the ways you continue to lead and guide this DDH community and have impact across our church. Thank you.
I have been reflecting upon this task of reflecting on the work of Dean Christine Culp, and both in my role in the institution of which we are all alumni and current students, the University of Chicago Divinity School, my role as a pastor within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and only so recently, my role as the nominee for the office of General Minister and President for a church that I dearly love and feel extremely honored to have been called to that particular role. I have benefited from Chris Culp's friendship, her mentorship, her continued counsel and advice. When I first came to the Divinity School, I was an older student. I was 39 and had a 9-year-old son. My husband Walter is here. He wanted to be here to say thank you to you, Chris, for what you have meant to me and to our family. But there was always a moment or two, continued opportunities for all of us, whether you were a resident of the house, whether you were an ecumenical resident, always an opportunity to be a part of this community. And for that reason, whether you are a disciple or not, Chris Culp has been dean, counselor, friend. This community has been a place in which you can be vulnerable. That term of vulnerability and then the opposite term of glory. In my tradition, people shout when you talk about the glory of God and a life lived before God. And the notion that in our humanity, in our frailties, that we could even begin to bear witness to what others might see in us and be able to access just a glimpse of that glory is a powerful thing. I want to share with you one of my favorite passages from the book, and it's in the glory section. And Chris says, "To receive and hear God is no simple matter of once and for all shaking off the world and closing the door on false teachers. It's not as simple as once and for all affirming ancient Christian teaching, belonging in the true church, or achieving Christian identity. Such approaches fail to attend to the possibilities of grace and transformation that emerge in unexpected places, say on the dangerous road to Jericho or on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. To be situated in the midst of life, in the crossroads of our day, is to dwell in ever-shifting, coercing, and enticing spaces. Messages and images flow ceaselessly, relentlessly through the spaces of our dwelling. Promise and threat itinerate through global media and marketplaces. Moment by moment, persons choose to reject or to welcome unexpected persons and information. Moreover, to be situated in the midst of life is not only a matter of acknowledging vulnerability, the capacity to be harmed or to be healed. It is also a matter of confirming ambiguity, the mixture of good and ill that is there." As a minister, and even as the Dean of Students at the Divinity School, and our Dean, Richard Rosengarten, is here in the corner. I want to acknowledge his presence, and there are several other faculty members. If you would all raise your hands, I know colleagues of Chris's who wanted to be here to share in this celebration. Ambiguity is not only part of life before God, it's part of the life of the mind. And one of the things that during my tenure as Dean of Students I have been really committed to, and a large part of that commitment comes from the institutional legacy of Disciples Divinity House, to ensure that people are able to find their own voice and also ensure that they are able to listen to other voices around them. Our How to Be a Colleague series really, I think, speaks to the ability to be vulnerable. Chris talks about a field of tensions. That we don't live in a dualistic world, although in our current public discourse, we are moving, unfortunately, to a place where you have to either be on one side or the other. But encouraging students not only in their intellectual lives to understand that when they engage in discourse, that they first must become vulnerable, to become self-aware, to be able to hear and to be able to respond to one another with respect, to really be able to listen to the various places in which they all stand. In this room, if we were to raise certain questions, we would create our own field of tensions, our own field of vulnerabilities, because we see and understand things in so many different ways. One of the great gifts of my education at the Divinity School was to understand Christianity from so many different vantage points, from so many different places that I had never even considered before, and be able to be who I was, engage with others who did not see the world as I saw it, and walk away with friendships that have lasted me from that time until now. As I consider, and people are asking me to consider, the future of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we have this thing we call our polar star, unity. And we say that unity is not about uniformity, but it is about being able to walk with one another, really across a field of tensions. All of the things that will attack, all of the things that we will bump into, all of the questions that we will be asked as we live these creaturely existences before God, hoping to simply reflect some of his glory by ourselves being open to transformative vulnerability, to be able to consider that perhaps you might be right, to consider that there might be something I can learn from you, to consider that I may not actually be the benchmark for all of human existence, to consider that the arguments that I make are simply my arguments and not the end-all be-all of all human truth. For me, what resonates about this beautifully written work, and Chris, oh my gosh, I wish I had her gift of writing. I was inspired, and as I read it, I kept saying, that'll preach, that'll preach, that'll preach. Because many Christians, I've had the opportunity to work with newly church Christians at Salem Baptist Church, where my husband to be realistic about the understanding of who we are and what we bear witness to. Chris also quotes some of the work of James Gustafson, who was on her committee, or her advisor, I believe, in her doctoral work. And one of the lines that she quotes from him, he says, divine purposes have to be accomplished by human processes. Boy, did that hit me as I'm thinking about my next job. The vulnerability in which this very diverse church, Asian, black, white, gay, straight, conservative, liberal, north, south, Canada, Congo, we are all across the board, and it is indeed, in many cases, a field of tensions. And what I really pray that God will call us all to recognize in that space is that we are simply creatures seeking to reflect a bit of the glory of God. And we will all do it each in our own way. And if we can learn to allow each other to stand in spaces, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, then the work that we do, be it in the academy as we're listening to each other's thoughts and ideas, many of our students have no particular firm commitments. I'm very well aware of that, but still, the notion that we can listen to one another and dialogue with one another and hear each other's hearts and minds is such an important lesson as we grow to be human beings in a world where we've simply lost the notion of being vulnerable and respectful and bearing the glory of humanity, which I believe was created by God. I really cannot thank Chris Culp enough for her commitment to this institution that will outlive you, Chris, because you've cared for it as an institution. It has changed as human vulnerability will do. We have been transformed. Physically, it may not look like the same place as it did when you were a student here. The students who inhabit these halls have changed it year after year. Chris has been what she needed to be for each and every one of us. She has gathered aboard with the notion that there needs to be both diversity, authenticity, and care for this institution going forward into the next generation. That's why you all are here, to honor her, because she has informed you and instilled in you a love for this institution its relationship to the wider university and the Divinity School. I wish you could see our alumni lunches at General Assembly as April gave sort of the honor roll. There are people in this place who have come from this place who are leading our church, providing leadership, authentic, vulnerable, transformative leadership. And I know that we will not only bring wonderful accolades to this institution, but each of us in some ways bears an imprint of one who has been mentor and friend, Chris Culp. She has put me in touch with not only my own vulnerability, but my own possibilities, helping me to walk through many a field of tension, both as a pastor, as a dean of students, as a woman. I am grateful for her friendship. I am grateful for the example that she has set for how to mentor, for how to help people negotiate this crazy thing called life and see the possibilities, and maybe, just maybe, be in a place where we can all reflect just a little bit of the glory of God. I'm so grateful for all that you've been in my life, Chris. I'm so grateful for what I see before me because of your impact and your love and your great care. I pray that you know that you in your life have indeed borne witness to the glory of God. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for being my friend.